You wake to the sound of wedding bells echoing through the vaulted Cathedral of Bordeaux, November 25th, 1615. Their clang should speak of joy, but to your 14-year-old heart they toll like the iron summons of fate. The air is thick with incense, each breath almost choking as layers of golden Spanish brocade weigh heavy on your small frame. Attendants tug at the massive jeweled crown, threatening to slip from your head, and you try to still the trembling in your hands. The smoke shifts, and for a fleeting instant you glimpse your bridegroom, Louis, King of France, a boy scarcely older than you. His voice is barely broken, and he spent the morning hunting rabbits rather than preparing to meet his bride. When your eyes search for his, he looks away quickly, as if your gaze were too great a burden, his attention dropping to the stone floor beneath his feet. The cathedral itself seems to mock you. Every sound, your own shallow breathing, the murmured prayers of your attendants in Castilian, vanishes into its cavernous mouth, devoured by the thundering Latin Mass. Even your name dissolves in this foreign place. You are Anna Maria Mauricia, daughter of Philip III of Spain, yet France will not call you that. Here you will be known only as Anne, your very identity altered as part of the bargain struck between dynasties. Behind the velvet curtains of statecraft, you are no more than a pawn in the relentless chess game between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. Your childhood had been signed away years earlier. At 11, still feeding breadcrumbs to the peacocks in the gardens of Madrid's Royal Alcazar, your father informed you, he did not ask, that you would marry the boy king of France. No tears could change it. Your dowry, 500,000 crowns, was already promised, and Spain had calculated how much would be reclaimed if Louis died young. What no one calculated, what no one even considered, was whether two frightened children might ever find tenderness in such a union. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. The words of duty echo more loudly in your mind than the bells themselves. You will be Queen of France. But what did you know of France then? Only that it was a northern land where the sun was shy, where the language sounded like water gurgling over stones, and where your Aunt Isabella had vanished into a foreign life after her own marriage. You knew France and Spain had warred for generations. Your marriage was meant to seal a peace as fragile as spun glass, a peace balanced on the slender shoulders of children. The memory of your mother, Margaret of Austria, hovers close. She died when you were still young, leaving you to bear responsibilities far beyond your years, watching over siblings, leading prayers, standing as a little mother before you had finished being a child. Her absence makes this moment even heavier. Had she lived, perhaps she would have explained how to face such a destiny. Instead, you stand alone before God, the altar, and 100 watchful eyes, about to give yourself to a stranger. And yet, as the Archbishop's voice drones on, you cannot help but notice how vast the gulf between ritual and reality feels. These bells, meant to herald joy, toll more like a dirge. This crown, meant to signify sovereignty, feels like shackles pressing into your brow. You are not walking into a marriage, but into an exile. A girl of Spain, about to be buried alive within the cold stone of France.
The gardens of Madrid's Alcazar had once been your whole world. Sunlight shimmered through orange blossoms, the air alive with the sound of fountains, peacocks strutting like jeweled courtiers as you tossed breadcrumbs into the gravel paths. You were still a child then, hair unbound, your laughter echoing against the ancient Moorish walls. In those days, Spain was not a prison. It was a home. And yet, even there, duty was already carving its marks into your life. Your mother, Margaret of Austria, had loved those gardens too, but fever took her after childbirth, leaving you motherless before you were ready to understand what death meant. You were not yet 11 when her absence reshaped the household. Almost overnight, you inherited her role, guiding your younger siblings, leading prayers in the chapel, comforting crying children in the night. You became what courtiers quietly called La Pequeña Madre, the little mother. While other girls of your age still played with dolls, you carried the weight of real infants, whispered lullabies not to toys but to brothers and sisters who depended on you. Childhood was not something you lived through, it was something that slipped away while you weren't looking. It was in this state, half child, half woman, that your father summoned you one summer's day in 1612. The peacocks were pecking at the crumbs in your hand when he spoke the words that would echo for the rest of your life. You will be Queen of France. He did not soften them with gentleness, did not explain them as a possibility. It was a decree, not a choice. And with it, the gardens seemed to grow darker, the orange blossoms suddenly bitter in your nostrils. France! What did you know of that distant land then? Only fragments of fear. A country that had long been Spain's enemy, locked in battles where soldiers of both crowns spilled blood for dynasties that never bled themselves. A land of shadows and mist, where the sun rarely broke through, and where the language itself seemed alien, sharp and quick, like water rattling over rocks. You knew, too, that your Aunt Isabella had gone there to marry a French king years earlier, and she had never returned. She had vanished into that northern fog, her letters infrequent, her Spanish tongue forgotten. Was this to be your fate as well? For 3 long years, your future was negotiated not in whispers of love, but in brushstrokes of paint. Court painters labored to capture your face again and again, smoothing imperfections, softening youth into dignity. Each canvas was scrutinized to ensure you looked sufficiently Habsburg, noble in blood, modest in virtue, virginal in appearance. Across the border, Louis's likeness arrived in Madrid. A boy with sad eyes, a weak chin, dressed in lace as heavy as armor. Courtiers whispered that he was frail, that he preferred the company of his falconer more than that of any woman, and that his mother still ruled while he played at kingship with toy soldiers. But none of it mattered. The portraits were symbols, the signatures on parchment were the true reality. Every brushstroke, every seal, every carefully chosen word was meant to disguise a brutal truth. The peace between Spain and France was no more than sugar glass, fragile, shining, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. And you, your body, your name, your very childhood were the price of keeping that illusion intact. So, the girl who once scattered crumbs for birds now found herself scattered across Europe in painted likenesses, weighed and measured by strangers who would never hear her voice. With each exchange of portraits and letters, your fate narrowed until it became inevitable. By the time you turned 14, Spain and France had already written your life as if you were a chapter in a treaty, not a daughter, not a child.
The bells of Burgos tolled long before the bells of Bordeaux. On October 18, 1615, you stood in the great cathedral of Burgos, not before a groom, but before an empty chair draped in blue silk and lilies of France. It was Louis's throne in effigy, the hollow substitute for a boy you had never met, and yet it was to this emptiness that you pledged your vows. The archbishop's voice rang through the nave, his Latin as unyielding as stone. Anne of Austria, do you take Louis, King of France, as your lawful husband? You whispered, I do, though the air itself seemed to swallow the words, and courtiers leaned forward to hear if the child before them had managed to speak loudly enough for eternity. Your brother Philip stood in for Louis, a proxy groom, lending his presence to seal what ink and blood had already decided. You were scarcely more than a child, yet you wore your mother's wedding gown, altered, pinned, its Spanish gold embroidery heavy as armor on your slight shoulders. When the archbishop pressed you through the rites, when you laid your hand on holy scripture, it was not love that bound you, but dynasty, not desire, but diplomacy. You married absence. You became wife to a phantom. And in France, at the very same time, another scene unfolded. Your brother's bride stood where you should have stood. Elizabeth of France, Louis's younger sister, dressed in French silks, bent her head and whispered vows not to a man, but to an image. Philip, in absentia. Two princesses exchanged like rare birds, each caged by ceremony, fluttering wings clipped by treaties neither of you had signed. It was called a double exchange, a marriage pact dressed in symmetry. One Spanish princess for one French, two crowns cemented with two young brides. To the men who orchestrated it, it was elegant arithmetic. To the girls at its center, it was exile delivered in pairs. You and Elizabeth passed into each other's countries like shadows crossing in the night, never to return home, never again to be called daughters of your native soil. As you stood in that cathedral in Burgos, you felt the weight of absence pressing harder than any gold of your gown. The chair, draped in lilies, was colder, more implacable than any living groom could have been. You spoke vows to avoid, sealed your body and your fate to a stranger across the mountains. What greater symbol of your role could there be? A girl marrying silence, binding herself to nothing, and yet expected to become the beating heart of a kingdom that was not her own. When the archbishop's blessing ended, the choir swelled, and the courtiers clapped as if something miraculous had occurred. But all you felt was the hollowness of the chair before you, the empty space where a boy king should have stood. That absence would follow you long after Burgos, across rivers and mountains, into France itself. For in truth, you had not married Louis that day. You had married the void he left in his place.
The road north stretched like a punishment, 40 days of rattling wheels and rain that seeped through carriage seams to chill your bones. Each morning, you woke to strange ceilings, each night to beds that smelled of other people's lives. The food grew steadily unfamiliar, olive oil replaced by butter, garlic by cream, the taste of home disappearing meal by meal. And yet, your companions tried to make the journey feel less like an exile. Doña Estefania de Vigilan, who had been your mother's friend, told you stories of Madrid summers and whispered prayers when you woke trembling from dreams. Doña Catalina de Salazar, your tutor, rehearsed French phrases with you endlessly, correcting your accent until your tongue grew sore. And there was little Maria de Montemayor, your dwarf companion since childhood, who alone could make you laugh when the rains turned roads into rivers. Together, they wrapped the carriage in songs of Spain, strumming memory into the night air, their voices rising like a fragile defense against the storm. You sang with them sometimes, clinging to the cadence of home, even as each mile carried you farther away. But the journey was not only hardship, it was ritual. Every inn where you stopped became a stage for your transformation, Spanish courtiers drilling you in French court dances, reminding you that your gestures, your posture, your very breath must soon belong to another kingdom. They dressed you in gowns meant to impress French eyes, fabrics stiff with foreign fashion, while you longed for the light silks of Valladolid and Valencia. Even your laughter was corrected, too loud, too unrestrained for French etiquette. By the time you neared the border, you were already being remade, stripped thread by thread of the girl who had left Madrid. At last, you reached the island of peasants, a narrow strip of land floating in the Bidasoa River, neither Spain nor France, suspended between two worlds. There, on a platform built over the water, the ceremony of exchange unfolded with all the precision of theater. Spanish officials escorted you halfway across the island, then halted, unwilling to step onto French soil. French courtiers advanced from the opposite side, their plumes bobbing, their words sharp with a language that still felt like stone in your ears. In that suspended space, belonging to no country, you paused for a single human moment. Your brother, Philip, the same brother who had stood as proxy for your absent groom, embraced you tightly. His voice, hushed so only you could hear, pressed courage into your heart. Sé valiente, pequeña infanta. Remember, you are Habsburg blood. You clung to him, memorizing the smell of his cloak, the warmth of his hand, the familiar Castilian on his tongue. Then the moment ended. Spain had fulfilled its bargain. France awaited. You walked across the platform, each step pulling you further from everything you had known. Behind you, Spain receded. Your language, your family, the graves of your ancestors. Ahead lay France, a land that had claimed you without asking. Elizabeth of France passed you in the opposite direction, her face streaked with tears as she crossed into Spain. Two girls, traded like treasures, bound to strangers, each carrying the weight of two nations. You did not speak to one another, but your eyes met, mirrors reflecting the same fear, the same exile. As your foot touched French soil, the bells rang out again, announcing your arrival. But this time, they did not sound like joy or sorrow. They sounded like chains clicking shut. Your first glimpse of the French court struck you like a blow. In Spain, dignity had been measured in restraint. Dark velvets, veiled gazes, gestures tempered by gravity. Here in Bordeaux, it seemed the opposite ruled. The women's gowns plunged so low that flesh spilled above corsets like offerings to some strange god of fashion, their hair arranged in towering sculptures of braids and jewels that seemed to defy gravity itself. Gold memed, lace spilled, feathers quivered in candlelight. The hall buzzed with a cacophony of voices, French mingling with Italian, German, Dutch, even the clipped syllables of English envoys, but not Spanish. Not once did you hear the sounds of your childhood tongue. It was as though the language of your heart had been erased before you even opened your mouth. Then came the inspection. Maria de Medici, Queen Mother of France, swept toward you with the slow inevitability of judgment. She circled you as if you were a horse brought to market, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Her French, thickened by her Florentine accent, made even words of supposed welcome sound like threats. "She is smaller than expected," she announced to those gathered, her jeweled fingers lifting your chin, "and darker. Well, Spanish blood, what can one expect? At least she has good teeth. She will breed well enough, God willing." The hall laughed lightly, politely, as if such cruelty were merely a witticism. You stood still, the heat rising to your cheeks, but you said nothing. Queens, you were already learning, had no permission to protest. And then, at last, Louis entered. Your husband, your destiny. He was only 14, just like you, born 5 days apart in the same September of 1601. A coincidence courtiers called fate, whispering of divine alignment. But what stood before you did not look like providence. His shoulders were narrow, his hands trembled as though they struggled to belong to him, and he would not meet your gaze. When protocol demanded he greet you, his lips brushed your cheek like paper, cold and dry, and then he turned away as though the sight of you were too much to bear. The irony of your shared birth year pressed against your heart like a cruel jest. Destiny, they called it. But how could it be destiny when two children, bound by crowns and treaties, stood side by side in a hall of strangers and felt only fear? The courtiers clapped politely at the display of affection, their eyes hungry for spectacle. Yet in that moment, you understood a terrible truth. In France, love was a performance, and you and Louis were actors in a play neither of you wanted to perform.
The wedding feast stretched on for 7 endless hours, a performance of abundance in a hall where you sat beside a stranger who was now your husband. Platters of venison, gilded sugar sculptures, fountains of wine. Each course announced with fanfare, each toast lifted, as if joy truly filled the room. Yet joy had no seat at that table. You tried, twice, to speak to Louis, once about music. You had been told he played the lute, once about his family. Both times his replies were curt, barely more than single syllables, before he turned eagerly back to his hawking master to discuss falcons and hounds. You sat in silence, the noise of laughter and clinking goblets swirling around you like a storm in which you had no anchor. The Duke of Buckingham, an English guest, later wrote he had never seen a bridegroom look so miserable, as if he were being led to execution rather than to his marriage bed. You felt the truth of that in your bones. Louis did not look at you, not once, as though the very act of acknowledging you would shatter something fragile in himself. You were already learning that your presence was a burden, your role a duty he wished undone. And then, when darkness fell and the feast finally ended, the real trial began. French custom demanded a form of public confirmation that the marriage was valid. You were inspected under the eyes of physicians and court ladies who recited their observations in clinical detail, as though your body were an object of state importance rather than your own. Each word was recorded, preserved in ink for history, while you stood trembling, 14 years old, stripped of any sense of privacy. They dressed you in a ceremonial nightgown, then led you to the great bed where Louis waited. He looked more terrified than you, pale as the linen, eyes darting like a cornered animal. The archbishop blessed the bed. Maria de Medici spoke sternly about duty, heirs, and the salvation of dynasties. The physicians reminded all present of what was expected. At last, they withdrew, but you knew they lingered just beyond the door, listening for signs that would confirm the union. What truly passed between you that night remains a question history has never answered. The official record declared the marriage consummated. In the morning, sheets marked with blood were displayed before the court as proof. But whispers spread among servants that the stains came not from you, but from a sacrificed chicken, and that Louis had kept to the farthest corner of the bed, refusing to come near you at all. Whatever the truth, you never spoke of it, not in letters, not even in the most private moments of confession. What you knew as you lay awake staring at the canopy above your head was that something had broken before it ever began. You were Queen of France now, but you felt only emptiness, a void as vast as the cathedral in which you had spoken your vows. Alone in that great bed, you realized the terrible truth of your new life. You had not married a boy, nor even a king. You had married absence itself, and absence would be your first, most faithful companion in France.
The nights after your wedding stretched into years of silence. Louis did not return to your bed. 4 years passed, 1,460 nights in which you slept alone, in chambers vast enough to echo your own breathing. A queen without a husband, a wife without a marriage. The courtiers whispered, the kingdom waited, but Louis stayed away, as though even proximity to you were unbearable. He was a strange boy, your husband, fragile in body, troubled in mind, full of peculiar habits that the court tried politely to ignore. He could not bear the sight of women's bare shoulders. If confronted with even the mildest décolletage, he grew pale and sometimes fainted outright, his attendants rushing forward to steady him. He kept notebooks recording every death in Paris, compiling them with a fascination that verged on the morbid. He stuttered when nervous, which was almost always, and in your presence his words tangled so badly that he often fled corridors rather than attempt a greeting. Yet it was you, not he, whom the court blamed for the emptiness of your marriage. Each month that passed without a pregnancy was counted against you, not against the boy who would not lie beside you. Physicians summoned to your chambers examined you as if you were livestock, cold hands probing, declaring your womb cold, your humors unbalanced. They prescribed vile concoctions, ground pearls mixed with bull's blood, foul-smelling potions meant to warm the womb and awaken fertility. You swallowed them dutifully, gagging, knowing full well they cured nothing but the court's impatience. The whispers sharpened as the months turned to years. They said you were barren, that your body was cursed, that perhaps you were not even fully a woman. Each humiliation pressed deeper, each accusation carving away what little certainty you had left. You learned to hold your face still, while courtiers glanced at your stomach with thinly veiled scorn, to smile faintly when physicians muttered remedies that tasted of dust and despair. And still, Louis avoided you. He hunted, he trained falcons, he played soldier with his guards. He vanished into the company of his favorites, but never into your arms. You, Queen of France, were reduced to waiting, month after month, year after year, for a husband who would not come. By the end of those 4 years, it was not only your womb they called barren, it was your very existence at court, a presence without purpose, a queen in name only, shadowed always by absence.
In 1617, the silence of your marriage was shattered, not by reconciliation, but by blood. Louis, now 16, was no longer the timid boy who fainted at bare shoulders. Under the influence of his favorite, Charles d'Albert, Duke of Lune, he turned on the very powers that had shielded him. Concino Concini, the Italian minister who ruled France through the Queen Mother's favor, was assassinated on the Pont du Louvre, his body mutilated by a mob while Louis watched from a palace window. At last the young king claimed power for himself, but his first act was not mercy, it was vengeance. Maria de' Medici, the mother who had protected you, was driven into exile at Blois. Her absence left you naked in a court that had tolerated you only because she had commanded it. Suddenly, the courtiers no longer had reason to cloak their disdain. You were Spanish, foreign, barren, and now defenseless. The icy glares that once softened under the Queen Mother's eye hardened into open hostility. Then came the purge. On a gray April morning, you awoke to the sound of boots in the corridor. French guards, faces stern, stood at your chamber door with lists in hand. One by one, they read out the names of those who had been your lifeline in this alien world. Doña Estefania, who had held you through childhood terrors. Doña Catalina, who had taught you French gently, patiently, softening its edges with laughter. Even little Maria, your dwarf companion who had been with you since you were 7, all declared spies, all ordered to leave within hours. You begged Louis, your husband, to let you keep just one of them, one familiar voice, one soul who knew the cadence of your mother's lullabies. But Louis, still trembling with the thrill of his coup, refused. Spain is France's enemy, he told you, his tone colder than steel. You must learn to be French. And so the last threads of your Spanish life were cut. The sound of your native tongue disappeared from your chambers. No one sang the songs of Valencia to drown the rain. No one whispered prayers in Castilian when the nights grew long. Your language, your comfort, your childhood, all expelled in carriages bound south. You stood alone in gilded rooms that now felt like cages, the walls closing in with their silken suffocation. Even the mirrors seemed to mock you, reflecting not the girl who once laughed in Madrid's gardens, but a queen emptied of identity. You dreamed in Spanish still, but woke each morning to a silence in which no one understood the words on your lips. You had lost your companions, your language, your protection. What remained to you was only the cold knowledge that France had stripped you bare of everything except the crown, and the crown, you were learning, was the heaviest emptiness of all. You tried, God knows you tried, to make yourself French. With your Spanish attendants gone, you had no choice. Seamstresses pressed you into gowns cut scandalously low, fabrics stiff with whalebone and pearls, designed to bear more skin than you ever thought a queen should. where in Spain dignity had been wrapped in restraint. In France, it was measured by how boldly a woman displayed her body while pretending modesty. You stood in mirrors, your own reflection half a stranger, the golden Spanish brocades of your youth replaced by silks that left you shivering in their exposure. Then there was etiquette, a labyrinth designed not for elegance but for control. Every gesture, every movement of the hand, every step in a hallway had prescribed rules. To hand the king a glass of water required 43 steps of ritual, each one scrutinized by watchful eyes eager to pounce on the slightest mistake. Servants reported not only what you did, but how you did it. For in France, ceremony was politics, and a queen's dignity could be undone by the way she lifted a spoon. You forced yourself to learn the dances of the French court, intricate steps that spun you in measured circles, all precision, none of the wild passion of Spanish flamenco. Your feet followed the patterns, but your heart felt none of the fire. You learned the language too, shaping your tongue around its sharp consonants and liquid vowels until you could converse smoothly enough. Courtiers praised your progress. They even began to forget that your Spanish accent had once betrayed you. But though you learned to think in French, you never learned to dream in it. Each morning you woke with Castilian words still warm on your lips, only to meet blank faces when you whispered them aloud. Your ladies-in-waiting smiled politely, not understanding, not caring, while the familiar syllables dissolved into silence. The songs of your childhood, the prayers your mother taught you, the jokes your siblings once shared, all of it withered into memory, unspoken in a world that demanded you perform Frenchness at every breath. And so, day after day, you put on your mask of pearls and silk, bowed at the right angles, spoke in the proper tongue, danced the careful steps, and played the role they demanded. But beneath the mask, the loneliness grew sharp enough to wound. For though you could mimic their words, their manners, their fashions, nothing could change the truth that lived in your marrow. You were Spanish still, a foreign heart trapped in a gilded cage, performing a role while losing yourself piece by piece.
In 1619, after years of avoidance, Louis at last began to visit your bed, not out of affection, not from some newfound tenderness, but because his advisors urged him to secure the succession. His presence in your chamber was dutiful, mechanical, as if he were swallowing a bitter draught prescribed by state. He arrived after dark, performed his obligation with all the warmth of a physician's inspection, and left without a word. Still, you clung to the faintest spark of hope. Perhaps now you might bear the child that would silence the whispers, that would give your exile purpose. That winter, you conceived. The court erupted in joy. Te Deums were sung in churches across France. Bells rang as if the kingdom itself were preparing to cradle your child. For the first time since your arrival, you felt the weight of expectations shift toward pride. Perhaps, you thought, motherhood would root you in this foreign soil. But in December, your labor ended in silence. A perfectly formed son was born, but he never drew breath. They wrapped him in silk before you could hold him. Yet you caught one fleeting glimpse, Louis's weak chin, your dark hair, and then he was gone. The court wasted no time in assigning blame. Whispers spread that you had eaten the wrong foods, that your humors were corrupted, that perhaps your Spanish blood itself carried poison. Even as you bled, pale and shaking, Louis stood at the foot of your bed, his face carved in disgust. He spoke only 5 words: "Try harder next time." You did. Within months, you conceived again. This time the physicians confined you, forbidding you to dance, to walk, even to read too passionately, lest it excite your humors. You lay imprisoned in your chambers, staring at windows you were not allowed to open, watching the seasons change without touching the air. When at last you begged for just a little freedom, 2 ladies took you into the gardens. You laughed, running a few steps, intoxicated by movement, then tripped on your heavy skirts. The stumble was minor, but by evening you were bleeding. The second child was lost.
Louis's rage was thunderous. He stormed into your chamber while you still lay weak and accused you of murdering his heir. His voice carried through the palace. You are 21 years old and cannot perform the one function for which you were purchased. Purchased. Not married. Purchased. The word fell like a stone into your chest, crushing what little dignity remained. The pattern repeated, year after year. 4 stillbirths in all. 4 tiny coffins carried from your chambers. With each one, Louis's contempt grew sharper. The courtiers' whispers harsher. They muttered of curses, of barrenness, of divine judgment. The physicians bled you, starved you, forced upon you concoctions of ground pearls, of powdered antlers, of bull's blood, as though alchemy could force life where despair had made its home. Nothing worked. By the time the 4th child was lost, you no longer wept openly. You had learned that grief was dangerous, that tears only fueled accusations. Instead, you carried your sorrow in silence, hidden behind jeweled veils and painted smiles. But inside, the despair gnawed at you like a living thing. You had been brought to France to give life, and all you had given was death.
By the mid-1620s, France had found itself under a new master, not the timid king, but his iron-willed minister, Cardinal Richelieu. To you, Anne, his rise was like a slow tightening of a net around your throat. Where Louis was weak, Richelieu was merciless. Where Louis wavered, the cardinal was relentless. He viewed you not as a queen, not even as a woman, but as a political liability, a Habsburg princess planted in the heart of France. His suspicion of you became obsession. He filled your household with spies, carefully chosen and loyal to him alone. Even the walls of your chambers seemed to listen. Your ladies whispered your words back to him. Your letters were opened before they reached their destinations. Worst of all, even your confessor betrayed you. Each prayer, each confession of despair reported back to the cardinal as evidence of your disloyalty. You learned to measure every word, to bury every true thought deep inside so that only silence could not be used against you. It was a lonely prison, but not without cracks of light. In 1626, Marie de Rohan, Duchess of Chevreuse, swept into your life. Brilliant, reckless, intoxicating, she was everything you were forbidden to be. Where you moved cautiously, she laughed at danger. Where you lowered your eyes, she dared to stare down any man, even the cardinal himself. To you, she became more than a lady of the court. She was confidant, sister, co-conspirator. With her, you could unlace the mask of caution and breathe. Together, you plotted small rebellions, secret meetings, coded letters, alliances whispered in gardens under the cover of night. Madame de Chevreuse knew the art of intrigue like a born player at chess, and she swept you into her dangerous games with a thrill that made you feel alive again. She taught you that survival in France was not passive endurance, but a constant duel with eyes that watched from every shadow. But Richelieu was always listening. His spies circled like wolves, waiting for a misstep. You had to live like a woman walking across thin ice, each gesture calculated, each glance rehearsed. You became a master of masks, smiling at Louis, nodding at Richelieu, while inside you built a fortress of secrets. It was the beginning of a long battle, a war not of swords, but of silence and shadows. And though you did not yet know it, this friendship with Madame de Chevreuse would become both your salvation and your ruin.
The year 1630 was the closest you ever came to freedom, Anne. For one shimmering day, it seemed as though Richelieu's iron grip might finally be broken. The court called it La Journée des Dupes, the day of dupes, and for a few precious hours, you believed the game might turn in your favor. You stood not alone then, but beside Maria de Medici, the formidable Queen Mother, who had never forgiven Richelieu for pushing her aside. Together you dared to move against him,
to wrestle power back from the minister who had made you both strangers in your own palace. In hushed corridors, in secret councils, there were promises whispered. Richelieu would fall, and the kingdom would breathe again. For a heartbeat, victory seemed real. Richelieu's enemies gathered, ready to strip him of his titles and drive him into exile. You allowed yourself to imagine it. The court cleansed of spies, the walls no longer whispering. A king who might look at you without fear because his great shadow had been removed. Perhaps even the chance of a marriage reborn. But Louis, ever timid, ever pliant, proved once more that his weakness was Richelieu's greatest strength. In a final confrontation, the cardinal threw himself at the king's feet, swearing loyalty, offering tears as weapons, and Louis, unable to stand alone, forgave him. In that moment, all your hopes shattered. The cost of failure was swift and merciless. The Queen Mother, humiliated, was exiled. Your allies were scattered to the winds. Those who had dared to plot with you were disgraced, imprisoned, were silenced. And you, Anne, were left even more isolated than before. Your every move now monitored with renewed suspicion. The day of dupes had promised deliverance but delivered only chains. Then, in 1635, the final blow, war between France and Spain. The fragile thread of peace that had once bound your childhood to your marriage was severed. You, daughter of Spain, were now wife of France's king, yet both sides doubted your loyalty. In Spain, you were remembered as the sister who had been bartered away. In France, you were mistrusted as a Habsburg spy. And so you lived, suspended between two worlds, accused no matter where you turned. To your birth family, you were half lost. To your adopted country, half foreign. You belonged wholly to neither. It was a cruel fate. The woman chosen to bind two nations together had instead become the embodiment of their division. Your crown, Anne, had never felt heavier.
The year 1637 brought you to your darkest humiliation, Anne. It began with paper and ink, letters you had written in secret, words to your brother, to Spain, to the family whose blood still ran in your veins. Perhaps they were simple exchanges of affection, perhaps whispers of news, but in a France poisoned by suspicion, they were enough to damn you. Richelieu's net tightened. Couriers were intercepted, codes deciphered, and suddenly your private words were paraded as weapons. The mighty Queen of France was dragged not to a battlefield, but to a chamber of accusation, as though you were some petty conspirator. Before the King's Council you stood, surrounded by men who looked at you not as their sovereign, but as a traitor. The charges cut deeper than any blade. To be branded faithless to France when you had given your youth, your womb, your very identity to this land, it was an insult that seared your soul. You had been married to a stranger, stripped of your companions, forced to bury your language in silence, and yet they demanded more. They demanded your very heart renounce the family that raised you. Louis, your husband in name, was no shield. He sat cold, distant, as though the trial of his wife was merely a matter of state. There was no tenderness, no flicker of doubt in his eyes. When he condemned you with silence, it was as if your marriage itself was pronounced dead. And so you endured the spectacle, questioned, humiliated, your dignity stripped away. Though no executioner's sword followed, the verdict was its own kind of death. The court watched you with narrowed eyes, whispering behind their fans. From that moment on, you were queen in title only. The woman beside the king was tolerated, not trusted, displayed, not embraced. France had claimed your crown, but never your loyalty. Spain had kept your heart, but never your body. And now both kingdoms regarded you with suspicion, a pawn that had outlived her purpose. What remained, Anne, except the bitter knowledge that you were married to a throne, not a man, and that in the eyes of France you were forever foreign, even when you knelt before its altar and bore its crown?
The storm came like destiny itself. Howling winds, rain battering the stones of Saint-Maur, tearing its shutters until even the king could not return to his own apartments. Forced by circumstance, Louis remained in your chambers that night. For years you had lain side by side as strangers, the bed between you colder than the Pyrenees that divided your two countries. Yet on that night, something shifted. Was it true passion or merely duty performed in silence? History leaves the moment veiled in ambiguity, but it was enough. Months later, the court trembled with disbelief. You were with child. After 2 decades of suspicion, loss, and whispered curses of barrenness, your womb carried the hope of France. Every prayer, every candle lit in Notre Dame seemed to point toward you. And in September 1638, beneath vaulted ceilings and watchful eyes, you brought forth a son, Louis Dieudonné, God-given. The cries of that infant drowned out years of mockery. For the first time, you felt the crown weigh less heavily on your brow. All of France rejoiced. Bells rang across Paris, cannon fire announced the miracle, and you, Anne, stood not as the foreign queen accused of treason, but as the mother of the future. It was not just a child you delivered, it was legitimacy, redemption, survival. 2 years later, another blessing followed. Philippe, your second son. With him, the fragile miracle of 1638 was confirmed as destiny. No longer did you walk the corridors with the eyes of courtiers piercing your back. You held in your arms the heirs of France, and for the first time since your arrival, your place was secure. Yet, even in triumph, the memory of humiliation lingered. You knew too well how quickly fortune shifted, how fragile a queen's dignity could be. But now, at last, you were more than a pawn in treaties, more than a barren wife under suspicion. You were a mother, the role that France could neither deny nor take away. In the cries of your newborns, you heard a promise. Your life's sorrows had not been in vain.
Louis's body had always been frail, but by the early 1640s, it became a shadow of itself. Tuberculosis gnawed at him slowly, reducing the king to fits of coughing, cold sweats, and the hollow look of a man who had always been more ghost than monarch. While Richelieu's iron hand still ruled the kingdom, his own death in 1642 seemed, for a brief moment, to open the possibility of reconciliation between husband and wife. But Louis, distrustful even in his last days, left behind a will that cut deep. It was his final blow, a carefully crafted document that would strip you of true authority after his passing. The will appointed a council of guardians, men loyal to him, not you, to govern France in the name of your young son, the Dauphin. It was a last act of control, a way of ensuring you remained, in his mind, a foreigner tolerated, not trusted. When he died in May 1643, France mourned a king it had never quite loved. You mourned something different. The years stolen, the companionship denied, the constant shadow of suspicion. And yet, grief could not blind you to danger. You understood at once what the will meant. Your children, the very heart of your survival, could be reduced to pawns in the hands of men who would rule in their names. It was here that your true genius revealed itself. Summoning courage sharpened by decades of humiliation, you went to the Parlement of Paris. With dignity and fire, you argued not as a grieving widow, but as the mother of France's future.
The will, you declared, was a betrayal of custom, of law, of the natural rights of a queen mother. You did not plead, you commanded. The Parlement annulled the will. With a stroke of legal brilliance, you swept aside Louis's final chains. And just like that, you stood not as the discarded Spanish bride, nor as the queen who had once been spied upon and accused, but as Anne of Austria, regent of France. In that moment, every humiliation you had endured seemed to bow before this reversal of fate. The foreign child sold for a crown had become the guardian of a kingdom. The crown was no longer your husband's shadow. It was your own to bear.
Regency transformed you, Anne. No longer the timid bride silenced by foreign tongues, no longer the barren queen spied upon and humiliated. You emerged as something new, a woman hardened by years of exile within her own marriage. At your side rose Cardinal Mazarin, the Italian protégé of Richelieu. Where others saw a stranger, you saw a mind sharpened like a blade, a heart bound, perhaps too closely to your own. Whispers filled Paris, that the queen was no longer alone in her chambers, that power and intimacy had entwined. Whether true or not, it mattered little. The partnership was real, and it was formidable. When the Fronde erupted in 1648, the nobles of France sought to break the crown, to topple the authority of a regency led by a foreign-born queen and her foreign-born minister. The parliament schemed, princes rebelled, and the city of Paris itself turned hostile. Yet you did not flinch. You led your sons, little Louis and Philippe, through darkened corridors, into carriages fleeing the capital under cover of night. You, who had once wept in solitude at a court that mocked you, now faced down rebellion with iron composure. In the long years of the Fronde, you became the steel backbone of the monarchy. You negotiated when words were needed, deceived when cunning was required, and stood firm when force alone could secure the crown. Soldiers and courtiers alike began to see not the foreigner, not the helpless widow, but the Queen of France, unyielding, unbroken. By the time the uprisings collapsed, your sons remained safe, their inheritance intact. You had protected not only their thrones, but the very structure of monarchy itself. From humiliation, you had drawn power. From betrayal, you had learned strategy. And from isolation, you had forged an unshakable will. Anne of Austria was no longer a girl bartered in dynastic exchange. She had become the regent who held France together in its hour of chaos.
By 1651, your son was declared of age, Louis XIV, no longer the child you had carried through nights of rebellion, but a young king with a crown truly his own. And yet, Anne, your shadow lingered. You had guided him through boyhood, protected his throne through fire and treachery. And though he stepped forward into manhood, your voice still weighed in council, your instincts still guided France. You were no longer only a mother, you were the regent who had trained a monarch. The years carried you toward a strange echo of your own youth. In 1659, the Treaty of the Pyrenees sealed peace between France and Spain, that same fragile frontier across which you had once been traded like a gilded hostage. This time, it was your niece, Maria Teresa of Spain, who became the bride, and the groom, your son. The irony struck deep, the cycle repeating, the sacrifice of young hearts for crowns. You watched her cross the border, a girl in Spanish silks, stepping into the same silence you had once endured. Perhaps you prayed her fate would be gentler. Then came the reunion that seemed a dream, a vision carved from memory and loss. After 45 long years, you embraced your brother Philip IV of Spain, the boy you had kissed farewell on the island of Pheasants, now an aging king. For a moment, the weight of crowns melted away, and you were once more siblings, children of the Habsburg bloodline. But even in that embrace lingered the cruel truth. You were not wholly his anymore. You belonged to France, not by birth, but by decades of survival, of cunning, of rule. This was the paradox of your life. You were born an infanta of Spain, raised in its gardens, lulled by its language. Yet the storms of destiny had reshaped you into something else, a French regent, a defender of Bourbon power, the very guardian of a monarchy that once had scorned you. Spain was your blood, France your crown. You lived suspended between them, never entirely at home in either, yet indispensable to both. By the time Louis took the reins fully in his own right, you had carved out for yourself a legacy larger than the humiliations of your youth. You were no longer just Anne of Austria, the unwanted bride. You were the queen who had turned survival into sovereignty.
In your final years, Anne, the storms at last began to quiet, but never entirely. The death of Cardinal Mazarin in 1661 struck like a hollowing blow. He had been your partner in power, your shield, perhaps even your heart's solace in a life so barren of tenderness. With him gone, you withdrew, not into despair, but into something more resolute: silence, piety, a cloistered dignity. You became a patron of convents, a woman who sought in prayer what politics had denied you: peace. Yet even from the shadows you could not stop watching. You saw your son, the Sun King, rise in brilliance, bending all of France around his orbit. He was everything his father had not been: radiant, confident, insatiable for power. And yet, in his marriage, you recognized a cruel echo. Louis treated Maria Theresa, your niece, with the same indifference that had once broken you. History repeated itself like a wound passed down through bloodlines. You, who had once been a child bride in a foreign court, now watched your own blood endure the same coldness, the same isolation. Perhaps you whispered to her in secret, "Endure, endure." Illness crept upon you slowly, mercilessly. Breast cancer, unspoken in whispers, wasted your body while your will remained iron. Even as pain gnawed at you, you did not cry out. You had been forged in suffering too long to surrender now. When death finally came in 1666, it did not conquer you. It released you. They laid you to rest beside the king who had never loved you, Louis XIII, as though marble could unite what hearts never did. History remembers you with a title that is both triumph and prison: the mother of the Sun King. Yet your true legacy is written in something deeper. You were the girl sold for peace, the queen spied upon and scorned, the widow who seized a kingdom's reins, the regent who outlasted rebellion. You were steel wrapped in velvet, faith sharpened by fire. And still, across the centuries, the bells of Bordeaux seem to echo, those same bells that once rang for your wedding, promising glory but delivering chains. They toll now not in celebration, but as a warning. Crowns are not garlands of roses. They are woven with thorns, and only the strongest learn how to bleed without breaking.